Hello and welcome. I hope you all enjoy tonight's cryptid horror stories. The Rake. Classified audio recording site 9 incident log 7342 date. Redacted time 03/47/18. Static, heavy breathing. The sound of metal scraping against concrete. Unknown soldier, command. Command, this is Specialist Marcus Webb identification. Identification Echo 974. I need to report a failure, a critical failure. The light went out. I let the light go out. I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry, Colonel. A wet dragging sound interrupts the transmission. Something heavy, something organic, sliding across what sounds like a grated metal floor. Unknown soldier whispering, it's still here. It's been watching me for 3 hours. 3 hours, command. It hasn't blinked. I counted. I watched its eyes. They don't reflect light like they should, like they're absorbing it, like they're hungry for it. The sound of fabric tearing. Not the clean rip of cloth, but something wetter, something that sounds like flesh parting from flesh. Unknown soldier, sobbing Corporal Yates is. He's in the corner. What's left of him? It didn't eat him. It just took him apart, piece by piece. While he was screaming, while we were all screaming, and it watched us watching. That's what it does. It doesn't just kill, it. A sound like a wet sheet being ripped in half. The soldier's voice cuts off abruptly. Unknown soldier, screaming, it's not an animal, it's not. The recording ends with a sound like liquid pouring onto metal, followed by silence. End transcript. Addendum. Recording recovered from body camera of Specialist Marcus Webb. Cause of death: massive cranial trauma consistent with blunt force impact. Body found inverted, suspended from ceiling by own entrails. No other personnel recovered. The Appalachian Mountains had never felt like a place that welcomed human presence. Not truly. The ancient peaks rose like broken teeth from the earth, their slopes draped in forests that had grown unchecked for millennia, swallowing the ruins of forgotten settlements and the bones of those who had tried to carve civilization into their flanks. In the remote regions where the fog never truly lifted, where satellite signals died and compasses spun lazily toward magnetic mysteries, the wilderness didn't just exist, it waited. Sergeant Diana Cross had spent 15 years in special operations, moving through the world's darkest corners with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a predator. She had extracted hostages from terrorist compounds in the Sahara, hunted war criminals through the jungles of Southeast Asia, and once spent 40 hours submerged in a Vietnamese river waiting for a single target to lower his guard. She had faced human monsters of every variety, men who killed for profit, for ideology, for the sheer pleasure of watching the light leave another's eyes. But nothing in her experience, nothing in the carefully catalogued nightmares of her career had prepared her for the Appalachian extraction. The mission had come through encrypted channels 3 days prior, marked with clearance codes that didn't exist in any official database. Scylla 6 was a designation that appeared nowhere in military records, a ghost team assigned to ghost objectives. The briefing had been conducted in a windowless room beneath Fort Bragg, attended by men and women whose faces seemed to blur in memory even as she tried to recall them. They had shown her photographs that didn't make sense, cattle torn open with surgical precision, their organs arranged in geometric patterns on the frozen ground, trees marked with rake-like gouges that spiraled upward in patterns too regular to be natural. And finally, the thermal image that had convinced her this was no ordinary assignment. The photograph showed a humanoid figure captured by infrared imaging, standing in a clearing approximately 40 miles from the nearest paved road. The creature's heat signature was wrong, not the warm bloom of mammalian life, but something cooler, something that registered more as absence than presence. It stood on legs too long for its torso, arms that dangled past its knees ending in fingers that the grainy image suggested were too numerous, too articulated. But it was the head that haunted her. An elongated skull bearing no nose to speak of, only hollow indentations, and eyes that caught the thermal imaging as twin voids of absolute cold. "We don't know what it is," the briefing officer had said, a man whose name badge read only specialist. "We don't know where it came from or how long it's been active. What we know is that it's responsible for 17 confirmed deaths in the past 8 months, and potentially dozens more dating back decades that were attributed to animal attacks or missing persons cases." "Why us?" Cross had asked. "Why not a containment team?" The specialist's smile had been thin and utterly devoid of warmth. "Because Sergeant Cross containment teams are designed to handle threats that follow predictable patterns. This thing, it learns, it adapts. It doesn't just hunt, it studies. It herded 3 separate search parties into each other last month, let them waste ammunition on each other in the fog before it took them one by one. We need operators who can think faster than it can." Her team had been assembled from the fragments of other failed units, specialists whose previous assignments had ended in classified disaster. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Cortez, her second-in-command, had survived an extraction in the Caucasus where his entire squad had been buried alive by an avalanche they hadn't triggered. Technical Sergeant Sarah Chen was a communications expert who had spent 6 months in a black site after her convoy encountered something in the Syrian desert that she still refused to describe. Private First Class Dwayne Myers was the team's heavy weapons specialist, a mountain of a man who had been transferred to Silla 6 after his previous unit had been wiped out during what official reports called a training accident. And finally, Corporal Kevin Yates, their medic and youngest member, who at 23 had already seen things in Eastern Europe that had earned him a psychological evaluation he had somehow passed. They were the broken pieces of broken teams, bound together by the understanding that some missions didn't appear in after-action reports, some enemies didn't have names in military databases, and some survivors were simply those who hadn't died yet. The insertion had been made by helicopter at dawn, the aircraft hugging the terrain to avoid radar detection, before depositing them on a ridge line that wasn't marked on any map the pilots had seen. Their equipment was standard Black Ops issue with significant modifications. High-frequency sonic disruptors capable of emitting directional pulses that could shatter glass at 50 meters, heavy-duty titanium restraints rated for twice human strength, and experimental targeting systems that supposedly could track biological anomalies through multiple spectrum analysis. "Remember," Cross had told them as they gathered their gear in the rotor wash of the departing helicopter, "this isn't a kill mission. Command wants this thing alive. We immobilize, we restrain, we extract. If it can't be captured, we document and withdraw. No heroics." Cortez had laughed at that, a sound like gravel scraping against stone. "Alive? You saw those photos, Sarge. Whatever that thing is, it's not going to let us put it in handcuffs without a conversation." "Then we make sure we're the ones doing the talking," Cross had replied, though even as she said it, she felt the weight of the lie in her chest. They had moved through the forest in tactical formation, their boots crunching softly against the frost-stiffened undergrowth. The Appalachian winter had come early this year, and the trees stood skeletal and bare, their branches creating a lattice work against the gray sky that filtered what little sunlight managed to penetrate the perpetual fog. Every 50 meters, they found the markers, gouges in the bark that spiraled upward in patterns that made Cross's eyes ache when she tried to follow them. The claw marks were too deep for any bear, too regular for any natural cause, and they seemed to form paths through the forest that led nowhere and everywhere at once. "These are fresh," Chen said, running her gloved fingers along the latest set of marks. "Within the last 12 hours, it's been here, it's watching us." "It's hurting us," Cross corrected, studying the pattern of marks that seemed to converge from multiple directions toward their position. "Look at the angles. These weren't made randomly. They're funneling us toward something." "Toward what?" Myers asked, his heavy machine gun tracking slowly across the tree line. That's what we need to find out. The first night had been spent in a hastily established camp, the team taking turns on watch while the others tried to sleep in shifts that never quite brought rest. The sonic disruptors were deployed in a perimeter, their passive sensors set to detect any movement larger than a deer within 200 meters. Cross had taken first watch, sitting with her back against a granite outcropping, her rifle across her knees, and her eyes trained on the darkness beyond the reach of their night vision equipment. She had heard it first, a sound like breathing, but wrong somehow, too shallow and too fast, as if whatever made it had lungs that didn't quite match its frame. Then came the smell, a sour, coppery odor that reminded her of old pennies and something else, something organic and rotten that made her stomach clench. She had raised her weapon, sweeping the infrared scope across the tree line, and for just a moment she had seen it, a shape too tall and too thin, standing motionless behind a lightning-split oak, its eyes reflecting the infrared light as twin points of alien cold. "Contact, northwest bearing 200 meters," she had whispered into her comms, her finger hovering over the trigger. But when Cortez and Myers had reached her position, when Chen had activated the floodlights and swept them across the clearing, there was nothing there. Only the tree, its bark freshly scarred with 4 parallel gouges that hadn't been there at sunset. It was right there, Cross had insisted, though she could hear the doubt in her own voice. "I saw it." "Maybe you did," Chen had said, her face pale in the artificial light. "Or maybe it wanted you to think you did." The second day had brought them to the limestone caverns, a network of natural tunnels that honeycombed the mountain's interior, carved by ancient rivers and expanded by geological time into a maze that local legends claimed had no end. The gouges in the trees grew more frequent as they approached, the patterns more complex, until Cross realized they weren't just markers. They were a language, a communication written in bark and wood pulp that she couldn't read but could somehow understand at a primitive level. "Danger, wait, watch." The creature was communicating with them, she realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. It was telling them exactly what it wanted them to know, guiding them toward the caverns with the patience of a shepherd driving sheep toward slaughter. "We should pull back," Yates had said, his voice trembling despite his efforts to control it. "This is wrong. This whole thing is wrong. It's not hunting us, it's playing with us." "We have our orders," Cross had replied, though she shared his assessment. "We proceed to the caverns. We set up a containment perimeter. We wait for it to come to us." The cavern entrance yawned before them like a wound in the earth, a mouth of darkness that seemed to absorb the light from their headlamps rather than reflect it. The air that emerged from its depths was warm and wet, carrying the scent of minerals and something else, something that made Myers mutter a prayer under his breath and Cross pretend she hadn't heard. They had established their base camp at the cavern mouth, stringing motion sensors across the entrance and setting up the sonic disruptors in a defensive array. Cross had assigned watches in pairs, no one allowed to stand guard alone. She had taken the first shift with Yates, sitting in the darkness with their backs to the stone wall, watching the forest for movement that never came. It was 3 hours past midnight when the screams began. They didn't come from the forest. They came from the cavern itself, from somewhere deep in its lightless depths, and they were the screams of men in agony, men whose voices Cross recognized with sickening clarity. She heard Cortez screaming for his mother. She heard Chen begging for mercy in Mandarin. She heard Myers reciting the Lord's Prayer between broken sobs. And she heard Yates, the Yates who sat beside her rigid with terror, screaming from the darkness as if he were already dead. "That's not real," she had whispered, though her hands shook on her weapon. "That's not them, it's mimicking them, it's trying to draw us in." "It knows our names," Yates had whimpered. "It knows our voices. How does it know our voices?" The screams continued for 17 minutes, each voice cycling through every member of the team in patterns that suggested the creature was studying them, learning their cadences and their fears. When they finally stopped, the silence was worse than the noise. A heavy, expectant quiet that made Cross's skin crawl with the certainty that something was waiting just beyond the reach of her light, watching her watch the darkness. We move at dawn, she had decided. We go in after it, we end this. But the creature had other plans. Corporal Yates was the first to die, though not in the way they expected. The perimeter alarm had triggered at 04:15, not from the cavern entrance but from above, from the canopy that had seemed empty and still in the starlight. Cross had looked up just in time to see the shape detach itself from the branches overhead, a pale blur of elongated limbs and impossibly long fingers that moved with a speed that defied physics. Yates had been standing 5 meters from her, his back to a pine tree, his rifle raised toward the cavern mouth. The creature didn't attack him from the front. It didn't use teeth or claws in the initial strike. It simply wrapped its arms around him from above, its hands covering his mouth and eyes with a gentleness that was somehow more horrifying than violence would have been, and lifted him straight up into the canopy. Cross had fired, her rounds tearing through branches and leaves in a futile attempt to track the shape that moved through the trees with the fluid grace of something that had never known gravity's full constraint. She had heard Yates' muffled screams fade upward, heard the wet sound of something yielding, something tearing, and then silence. "Yates," she had screamed, her voice echoing uselessly in the forest. The response had come not from above, but from the cavern entrance, where Cortez and Chen stood frozen in the floodlights. It was Yates' voice, perfectly replicated, calling out to them with words that made no sense. "The trees are hungry. The trees have always been hungry." Then the screaming started again, but this time it was real, and it went on much longer than Cross thought human lungs could sustain. They found what was left of him at dawn, arranged at the base of the pine tree in a pattern that suggested deliberation rather than savagery. His body had been opened with surgical precision, organs removed and examined, and returned to his chest cavity in arrangements that suggested study rather than consumption. His eyes were gone, replaced with pine cones that had been forced into the sockets with such violence that the orbital bones had shattered. And on his chest, written in his own blood in letters too neat to be natural, were 4 words. "Thank you for coming." Cross had stood over the remains of her medic, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. This wasn't an animal attack. This wasn't even the work of a deranged human. This was something that understood them, something that had watched them and learned their protocols and their fears. Something that had killed Yates not because he was the easiest target, but because he was the youngest, the most vulnerable, the one whose death would unnerve them the most. "It's smart," Chen had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's so much smarter than we thought." "Then we need to be smarter," Cross had replied, though she didn't know how. The extraction had become a hunt, but not the hunt they had planned. The creature led them through the forest with its markers, appearing at the edge of their vision only to vanish before they could fire, leaving traces of its presence that suggested it was always one step ahead, always watching from angles they couldn't anticipate. They found more dead livestock, more geometric arrangements of organs and bones, more messages written in blood that taunted them with their own ignorance. "We see you in the dark. Your lights are pretty. Why do you run?" By the 3rd day, Myers had stopped sleeping, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. Chen had developed a twitch in her left hand that made her drop her equipment. Cortez had begun talking to himself, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there. Cross had held them together by force of will alone, refusing to acknowledge the fear that had become a physical presence in her chest, a weight that made breathing difficult and thinking impossible. "The caverns," she had decided on the morning of the 3rd day. "It's herding us toward the caverns. That's where it wants us. That's where we'll end this." "End it how?" Cortez had asked, his voice hollow. "We can't kill it. We can't even see it until it's already taken what it wants." "Then we capture it," Cross had said. We use the sonic disruptors. Chen, you said the readings showed sensitivity to certain frequencies. We find the right one, we paralyze it, we restrain it. And if that doesn't work? Cross had looked at him then, really looked at him and seen the broken man beneath the soldier's mask. Then we die, she had said, but we die trying. The final approach to the caverns had been the most terrifying experience of her life, worse than any combat she had seen, worse than any nightmare she had endured. The creature didn't attack them. It didn't need to. It simply revealed itself at the edges of their vision, standing motionless behind trees, perched on branches overhead, watching them with eyes that didn't reflect light but seemed to generate their own cold luminescence. It showed them that it could take them at any moment, that their weapons and their training meant nothing against its speed and its strength. But it waited. It waited because it wanted them inside the caverns. It wanted them where the light couldn't reach, where the sonic disruptors would echo and confuse, where the hunt could proceed on its terms rather than theirs. They entered the limestone labyrinth at dusk, their headlamps cutting weak beams through darkness that seemed to resist illumination. The passages twisted and branched in patterns that made Cross think of the gouges in the trees, of a geometry that didn't belong in Euclidean space. The air grew warmer as they descended, and the smell of copper and rot became overwhelming. "Contact rear," Myers had whispered, and they had all turned to see the shape standing 30 meters behind them, blocking the passage back to the surface. It was the first time they had seen it clearly, and the sight was worse than Cross had imagined. The creature stood nearly 2.5 meters tall, its body elongated and emaciated, ribs visible beneath pale skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its arms hung past its knees, ending in hands that had too many fingers, each jointed in ways that suggested they could bend in any direction. But it was the face that made Cross want to scream, a skull-like visage with hollow indentations where a nose should be, and eyes. The eyes were voids, not black, not dark, but absent, as if something had scooped out the color and left behind perfect circles of nothing that somehow still managed to convey hunger and intelligence and something else, something that might have been amusement. "Sonic disruptors," Cross had screamed, and Chen had activated the devices, sending directional pulses of high-frequency sound toward the creature. The effect was immediate and devastating. The creature convulsed, its limbs spasming as the sound waves hit it, its mouth opening in a scream that didn't register on human hearing but made Cross's teeth ache and her vision blur. It fell to the cavern floor, thrashing in agony, its claws scoring deep gouges in the limestone. Now, Cross had shouted, "The restraints!" They had rushed forward, Myers and Cortez carrying the titanium cage they had brought for containment, Chen maintaining the sonic barrage while Cross approached the creature with the heavy restraints. The thing was still conscious, still watching her with those void eyes, and as she approached, it spoke. Not with words but with thoughts that inserted themselves into her mind like knives. "Thank you for coming. I have waited so long for new friends." She had pinned the creature beneath the weighted cage, the titanium bars locking into place with a sound that echoed through the caverns like a death knell. The creature didn't struggle against the bars. It simply lay there, watching them, its void eyes moving from face to face with what Cross could only describe as curiosity. "We have it," she had reported into her comms, her voice shaking. "Extraction team, we have the target in containment." The creature had smiled then, a terrible expression that involved too many teeth and no warmth. "Yes," it had whispered, the sound like dry leaves scraping against stone. "You have me, for now." The victory felt hollow as they transported the creature from the caverns, as they loaded it into the armored transport that would take it to Site 9. The thing didn't fight, didn't scream, didn't demand release. It simply watched them with those empty eyes, and Cross had the terrible certainty that they hadn't captured it at all. They had been captured, they just didn't know it yet. The creature had allowed them to take it. It had wanted to be brought to Site 9, to the facility carved into the heart of the dormant volcano, where the research teams waited with their instruments and their theories. It had wanted to be studied, to be observed, to be brought into the heart of their operation where it could do the most damage. As the transport vehicle bounced along the mountain roads, Cross sat across from the cage, her weapon trained on the creature that lay motionless within. It hadn't moved in hours, hadn't spoken since the cavern, but she could feel its attention on her, a physical pressure against her thoughts like a weight pressing against the inside of her skull. "What are you?" she had asked, knowing she wouldn't get an answer. The creature's head had turned slowly, impossibly slowly, until those void eyes met hers. "I am the dark between stars," it had whispered. "I am the silence in empty rooms. I am what waits when the light goes out. Why did you let us capture you?" The smile returned, stretching the pale skin of its face in ways that shouldn't have been possible. "Because, little soldier, you didn't capture me. I captured you. All of you. Your facility, your scientists, your entire world of lights and noise. I have been waiting so long for an invitation inside." Cross had wanted to shoot it then, to empty her magazine into that terrible face and be done with it. But her orders were clear, and the creature was secured, and she told herself that containment would hold, that the scientists would find answers, that they had won. She told herself these lies all the way to Site 9, while the creature watched her with eyes that held no light and promised only darkness. Site 9 had been carved into the heart of Mount Caldera, a supposedly extinct volcano that rose from the Appalachian foothills like a warning. The facility had no official designation in any government database, no postal address, no presence on satellite imagery. It existed in the spaces between records, funded by black budgets and staffed by people who had learned not to ask questions about the nature of their work. The approach was deliberately disorienting, a winding mountain road that seemed to loop back on itself, a tunnel that descended at angles that felt wrong to the inner ear, and finally, a brutalist concrete structure that emerged from the living rock like a tumor. Cross had been here before, though the memories were classified at levels she didn't have clearance to access. She remembered the smell of antiseptic and recycled air, the hum of generators that never stopped, and the feeling of being buried alive that permeated every corridor. Site 9 was where the unexplainable went to be explained, where the things that shouldn't exist were dissected and documented and stored away in vaults that had no keys. The creature had been transferred from the transport cage to a containment cell that had been designed for something else, something larger and more dangerous. The chamber was a cube of reinforced concrete and ballistic glass, 10 meters to a side, with observation ports that allowed cameras and sensors to track every movement without requiring human presence in the room. The glass was supposed to be unbreakable, rated for impacts that would shatter steel, and the concrete was lined with lead sheeting to block radiation and, theoretically, psychic influence. Dr. Elizabeth Vance had been waiting for them in the transfer bay, her white coat spotless and her expression carefully neutral. She was the facility director, a woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. She had supervised the containment of entities that defied physics, organisms that violated every principle of biology, and phenomena that suggested the universe was far stranger and more hostile than human science could explain. "Sergeant Cross," she had said, nodding without extending her hand, "I understand you had some difficulty in extraction." "We lost 4 people," Cross had replied, her voice flat, "and I don't think we extracted anything. I think we were led here." Vance's expression hadn't changed. "That's a common misconception with new specimens. The human mind wants to attribute intention to random events. It's a survival mechanism." "This isn't random. It spoke to me, in my head. It knew things it couldn't know." "We'll study that," Vance had said, turning toward the observation window that looked into the containment chamber. "That's why we're here, to understand." The creature had been placed in the center of the cell, still restrained in the titanium cage that Cross's team had used for transport. It hadn't moved since arrival, hadn't spoken, hadn't even seemed to breathe. It simply lay on the concrete floor, its elongated limbs folded beneath it, its void eyes fixed on the ceiling in an attitude that suggested patience rather than resignation. "What do you know about it?" Cross had asked. "Less than we'd like," Vance had admitted. "We've reviewed your field recordings, the thermal imaging, the biological samples you collected from the cavern site. The DNA is problematic. It has sequences that match no known organism, living or extinct. The cellular structure suggests it can regenerate damage at rates that shouldn't be possible. And the neurological readings." She had paused, consulting a tablet that displayed waveforms Cross couldn't interpret. "Its brain activity doesn't match any pattern we've seen. It's not human, not animal, not even alien in any way we can define." "It's not from here," Cross had said. "Not from Earth, not from anywhere in the universe we understand." "That's one hypothesis," Vance had replied, though her tone suggested she considered it the least likely. "The other is that it's a highly evolved terrestrial organism that has developed defensive mechanisms we haven't encountered before. Bioluminescent camouflage, advanced vocal mimicry, perhaps some form of electromagnetic field generation that could explain the telepathic experiences you reported." "It's not camouflage, it's not mimicry, it's something else." "We'll determine what it is through scientific observation," Vance had said firmly. "Not through speculation. That's the purpose of this facility. We don't fear the unknown, Sergeant. We catalog it." The research team had been assembled from specialists across multiple disciplines, each chosen for their ability to maintain professional distance from phenomena that would drive most people to madness or faith. Dr. Samuel Okonkwo was a biologist who had studied extremophiles in the deep ocean trenches, organisms that survived pressures and temperatures that should have been impossible. Dr. Patricia Reeves was a behavioral psychologist who had written definitive texts on predatory psychology and apex predators. Dr. Yuki Tanaka was a physicist who had spent her career studying quantum phenomena that suggested consciousness might be more fundamental to reality than matter. And Dr. Marcus Webb, no relation to the specialist Webb whose final transmission had opened this account, was a young researcher whose specialty was the intersection of biology and information theory. They had approached the creature with the clinical detachment of scientists examining a new species of beetle, noting its physical characteristics, its responses to stimuli, its biological functions. They had measured its height at 2.4 meters when standing fully upright, though it preferred a hunched posture that brought it closer to 1.8 meters. They had documented its weight at 89 kilograms, impossibly light for its size, suggesting hollow bones or some other structural adaptation. They had catalogued its skin texture, smooth and cool to the touch, almost rubbery, with pores that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The creature had allowed all of this without resistance, without protest, without any indication that it objected to being poked and prodded and measured. It had watched them with those void eyes, and occasionally it had smiled, and the researchers had noted these behaviors in their logs as possible threat displays or attempted intimidation tactics, without ever considering that the creature might be laughing at them. "It has no digestive system," Okonkwo had announced during the third day of study, his voice carrying the excitement of a man who has discovered something truly unprecedented. "No stomach, no intestines, no colon. The abdominal cavity is occupied by something else entirely, a network of capillaries and specialized cells that appear to absorb nutrients directly through the skin. It's like a plant, but for organic compounds. It can metabolize anything it touches." "That explains the livestock mutilations," Reeves had noted. "It wasn't eating them, it was absorbing them, touching them and taking what it needed." "But why the surgical precision?" Tanaka had asked. "Why arrange the organs in patterns?" "Communication," Webb had suggested, his voice hushed with wonder. It's leaving messages. The patterns mean something if we could only read them. They had been in the observation room, watching the creature through the ballistic glass, when it had moved for the first time since capture. It had risen from its crouched position, its joints bending in directions that made Reeves look away, and it had approached the glass. Not quickly, not threateningly, but deliberately, each movement precise and controlled. "Note the behavior," Vance had said, her voice steady. "It appears curious about its environment." The creature had placed its palm against the glass, spreading its too many fingers against the transparent barrier. And then it had spoken, not aloud but in their minds, a voice that was like hearing thoughts that weren't their own. "Your glass is pretty," it had said, and the words carried an emotion that might have been amusement. "But it is not strong. Nothing you build is strong." The researchers had frozen, their instruments forgotten, their scientific detachment shattered by the impossible violation of their minds. Webb had dropped his tablet. Reeves had made a sound like a wounded animal. Only Vance had remained composed, though Cross had seen the tremor in her hands. "Record this," Vance had ordered, her voice tight. "All of it, the phenomenon, the sensation, everything." "You want to study me," the creature had said, its void eyes moving across their faces one by one. "You want to know what I am, where I come from, how I work. I will tell you. I am the space between thoughts. I am the hunger that exists when food is gone. I am what remains when the light goes out." "Can you communicate verbally?" Vance had asked, her professional training reasserting itself. "Or is this telepathic contact the only method?" The creature had tilted its head, a gesture that seemed almost human. "I can make sounds. Your ears can hear them, but why would I? Words are clumsy, words lie, thoughts are true." "We need to establish protocols," Vance had continued, speaking as much to her team as to the creature. "If it can read minds, we need to limit exposure, rotate personnel. No one spends more than 30 minutes in its presence." "I do not read minds," the creature had said. "I inhabit them. I live in the dark spaces where your thoughts are not. I have been in all of you since you first saw me, since you first heard my voice in the forest. I am in you now, growing, learning, waiting." Cross had felt it then, the presence in her mind that she had been trying to ignore since the caverns. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like a weight, a pressure behind her eyes that suggested something was sitting in the spaces her thoughts didn't occupy, watching her think, learning her patterns. "Get out," she had whispered, and the creature had laughed, a sound like breaking glass and distant wind. "I cannot get out," it had said. "I am already home." The days that followed had been a descent into nightmare that the researchers tried to maintain as scientific study. They had established protocols, rotated shifts, limited exposure. But the creature was always there, in the edges of their vision, in the spaces between dreams and waking. They began to see it in their private quarters, standing at the foot of their beds, watching them sleep with those void eyes. But when they opened their eyes fully, when they turned on the lights, there was nothing there. "Shared night terrors," Reeves had diagnosed, though she didn't sound convinced. "The psychological stress of proximity to an unknown entity, mass hysteria." "It's not hysteria," Tanaka had insisted, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep. "I can feel it. When I'm about to fall asleep, I can feel it in the room with me, watching, waiting." "For what?" Webb had asked, his voice trembling. "For us to invite it in," Cross had said, and no one had contradicted her. The breakthrough, or the disaster, had come on the 7th day of containment. Dr. Marcus Webb had become obsessed with the creature, spending hours reviewing the footage of its capture, studying the patterns of its movements, trying to understand what it was and how it worked. He had developed a theory. The creature wasn't just a biological entity. It was a manifestation of something else, something that existed in the spaces between matter, between thoughts, between moments. It needed invitation not because of supernatural rules, but because it couldn't fully manifest in physical reality without a host, without a mind to anchor it. If we could communicate with it, he had argued to Vance, if we could establish a genuine exchange of information, we might learn things that would revolutionize our understanding of consciousness, of reality itself. We are communicating with it, Vance had replied, though she looked as tired as the rest of them. Every day we collect data, we observe, we document. That's not communication. That's observation. I'm talking about dialogue, real connection. It's too dangerous. It's necessary, Webb had insisted, and there had been something in his eyes that Cross recognized from her own mirror. The desperate need to understand, to solve the puzzle, to make sense of the senseless. He had gone to the creature alone, late at night when the facility was quiet and the other researchers were trying to sleep. He had lowered the security shields on the observation window, just enough to allow what he called a sensory exchange. He had believed that if he could touch the creature, if he could establish physical contact, he could bridge the gap between their species and learn its secrets. The creature had been waiting for him. Cross had been in her quarters, 3 levels above the containment chamber, when she felt it happen. Not heard it, not saw it, but felt it. A sudden pressure in her mind, like a door opening, like a light being extinguished, like something vast and hungry being unleashed. She had known, without being told, that the containment had failed, that the creature was free, that the nightmare had begun. She had grabbed her weapon and run, taking the stairs 3 at a time, her boots echoing in the empty corridors. She had reached the containment level just in time to see the ballistic glass pooling on the floor like liquid mercury, just time to see Dr. Webb standing in the doorway of the chamber, his hand outstretched toward the creature, his face lit with an expression of pure wonder. "It's beautiful," he had whispered, and then the creature had moved. It didn't attack him with claws or teeth. It simply stepped forward, its movements fluid and unstoppable, and embraced him. Its arms wrapped around his torso, its too many fingers spreading across his back, and it pulled him close with a gentleness that was somehow more obscene than violence would have been. "Thank you for inviting me," it had whispered, and then it had done something that Cross couldn't process, something that involved its skin opening like a flower, like a mouth, like a wound, and Webb had screamed as he was absorbed into the creature's embrace, his body folding into the pale flesh until there was nothing left but his shoes, still standing upright on the concrete floor. The alarms had been deafening, klaxons screaming through the facility as the creature stepped over the pool of former glass and into the corridor. It had looked at Cross with those void eyes, and it had smiled, and it had spoken in a voice that was somehow louder than the alarms. "Now we hunt." The facility became a slaughterhouse. The creature moved through the ventilation shafts and the emergency corridors with a knowledge of the architecture that suggested it had been studying the building since arrival, memorizing every vent and duct and access panel. It didn't kill quickly. It didn't kill efficiently. It killed with a deliberation that suggested it was savoring the experience, learning from each death, refining its techniques. Dr. Okonkwo had been the second to die. He had been running toward the emergency stairs, his white coat flapping behind him, when the ceiling panel above him had given way. The creature had dropped onto him from above, its weight crushing him to the floor, and then it had done what it did best. It had taken him apart with surgical precision while he was still alive, removing organs and examining them with the curiosity of a child dissecting a frog, arranging them on the tile floor in patterns that meant nothing to Cross but clearly meant something to the creature. Dr. Reeves had died in the cafeteria, surrounded by overturned tables and scattered food trays. She had tried to hide, had squeezed herself into a cabinet beneath the sink, and the creature had found her by smell or by sound or by some sense that didn't have a name. It hadn't opened the cabinet door. It had simply pulled the entire sink unit away from the wall, exposing her curled and trembling form. She had begged for mercy, had offered prayers to gods she had never believed in, and the creature had listened with what might have been patience before it had reached in and taken her eyes first, then her tongue, then her life. Dr. Tanaka had been smarter. She had understood that the creature was territorial, that it claimed space by killing everything within it. She had tried to reach the surface, to escape the facility entirely, and she had almost made it. Cross had found her at the base of the main ventilation shaft, her body wedged in the ductwork, her limbs bent at impossible angles. The creature had taken her there, in the narrow space where she couldn't run or fight or even scream properly, and had left her hanging as a warning to others who might try to escape. The survivors had gathered in the secondary control room, a reinforced space that the creature hadn't yet penetrated. Cross, Vance, and two security officers whose names she couldn't remember in the chaos. They had barricaded the doors, sealed the vents, and tried to think of a plan while the creature hunted through the facility below them, its presence announced by the occasional scream or the wet sound of something being dragged across concrete. "The pheromone lures," Vance had said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and grief. "We have them in storage, experimental compounds designed to attract biological specimens." "You want to draw it to us?" one of the security officers had asked. "No, we want to draw it away. The secondary containment vault, the one we prepared for larger specimens. It's reinforced, isolated, has its own life support. If we can lure it in there, seal it inside." "It'll just get out again," Cross had said, "like it got out of the first cell." "Not if we don't give it a way out," Vance had replied. "The vault was designed for entities that can't be killed, only contained. It has no ventilation, no maintenance access, no way in or out once sealed. If we can get it inside, trigger the lockdown." "It'll die in there," the other officer had said. "Eventually," Vance had agreed. "But that could take years, decades, and in the meantime it won't be hunting us." They had prepared the trap with desperate speed, activating the pheromone emitters and placing them in a trail that led from the control room to the secondary vault. Cross had carried the sonic disruptors, the devices that had paralyzed the creature in the caverns, hoping they would be enough to drive it toward the trap if the scent alone wasn't sufficient. The creature had taken the bait, but not in the way they expected. It had appeared in the corridor ahead of them, not behind, its void eyes reflecting the emergency lighting with something that might have been amusement. "You think you can trap me," it had said, and the words echoed in their minds with a weight that made Cross's knees weak. "You think your walls and your locks can hold what I am. I am not flesh. I am not bone. I am the space between, and space cannot be contained." "Now," Vance had screamed, and Cross had activated the sonic disruptors, sending the high-frequency pulse directly at the creature. It had worked, but barely. The creature had convulsed, its limbs spasming, its mouth opening in a silent scream that Cross could feel rather than hear. It had stumbled backward, away from the sonic source, toward the open door of the secondary vault where the pheromones were strongest. "Keep pushing it," Vance had shouted, and they had advanced, Cross maintaining the sonic barrage while the others flanked the creature, herding it toward the containment. The creature had fought, but the frequency was right, the disruption was working, and it had retreated step by step until its back was against the threshold of the vault. It had looked at them then, really looked at them, and its void eyes had seemed to hold depths that shouldn't have been possible. "You think this is victory," it had whispered, even as it stumbled into the vault. "You think you have won, but I do not need walls to walk through. I do not need doors to enter. I am in you already. I have always been in you." They had sealed the vault, triggering the emergency lockdown that engaged 10 tons of reinforced steel and concrete. The creature's screams had been muffled by the walls, then silenced entirely as the life support systems activated, flooding the chamber with gases designed to render biological entities unconscious. "We did it," the security officer had breathed, his face pale with relief. "We actually did it." "We need to evacuate," Vance had said, already moving toward the emergency stairs. "The facility is compromised. Protocol demands destruction of all materials and withdrawal of personnel." They had made their way to the surface through passages that seemed longer and more convoluted than Cross remembered from their arrival. The self-destruct sequence had been initiated, a countdown that would collapse the tunnels and bury the facility under thousands of tons of mountain rock. They had reached the extraction point with minutes to spare, a clearing in the forest where a helicopter was supposed to retrieve them. The helicopter had never come. They had waited in the clearing, watching the facility entrance for any sign of pursuit, listening to the countdown in their comms. The explosion had been anticlimactic, a muffled thump that sent dust rising from the tunnel entrances, a slight tremor in the ground beneath their feet. Site 9 was gone, buried under the mountain, the creature trapped in its vault beneath tons of concrete and stone. "It's over," Vance had said, and she had almost sounded convinced. They had walked out of the wilderness over the next 3 days, following the ridges and valleys toward the nearest road, the nearest town, the nearest semblance of civilization. Cross had watched Vance grow more withdrawn with each step, her eyes darting toward shadows that weren't there, her hands trembling when she thought no one was looking. The security officers had stuck together, speaking in low voices about families they hoped to see again, jobs they hoped to return to, lives they hoped to reclaim. Cross had said nothing. She had walked in silence, her mind circling the same terrible certainty that had been growing since the vault had sealed. The creature's final words, its claim that it didn't need walls or doors, its insistence that it was already inside them. They had reached a safe house on the 4th day, a cabin in the foothills that was maintained by the same shadowy organization that had funded Site 9. It had electricity, running water, a radio that could contact their handlers. They had sent their report, requested extraction, and been told to wait 48 hours for pickup. Cross had taken the bedroom at the end of the hall, a small space with a single window that looked out on the forest. She had locked the door, checked the window, and lain down on the bed fully clothed, her weapon within arm's reach. She had told herself that it was over, that the creature was buried under a mountain, that she was safe. She had fallen into a sleep that was deeper than she intended, a blackness that swallowed her consciousness without dreams or awareness. When she woke, it was to the feeling of cold air on her face, to the realization that the window she had locked was now open, letting in the night breeze and the sounds of the forest. She had sat up slowly, her hand moving toward her weapon, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. The room was empty, she told herself. The window had come unlatched. The cold was just the night air. There was nothing to be afraid of. Then she had turned to look at the foot of the bed. The creature stood there motionless, its void eyes fixed on her with an intensity that suggested it had been watching for hours. Its skin seemed to absorb the faint moonlight that filtered through the window, making it appear as a silhouette of deeper darkness against the night. It didn't move, didn't speak, didn't attack. It simply watched her with the patience of something that had waited millennia and could wait millennia more. "How," Cross had whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're buried under a mountain, you're locked in concrete, you're—" "I am where you are," the creature had said, and its voice was soft, almost gentle. "I have always been where you are. Since the caverns, since the transport, since the first moment you saw me in the forest. I planted myself in the dark spaces of your mind, and there I have grown. The body you locked away was never me. It was only a vessel, a way to touch your world. I am in you now, Sergeant. I am in all of you. And when you sleep, when the light goes out, I walk through the halls of your dreams and make them my own." Cross had reached for her weapon, her hand shaking so badly she could barely grip the handle. But the creature hadn't moved, hadn't tried to stop her. "You cannot kill me with bullets," it had said. "You cannot trap me in walls. I am the dark between thoughts, the silence between heartbeats. I am what remains when everything else is gone. And I have waited so long for you to invite me in completely." "I never invited you," Cross had said, her voice rising toward panic. "I never said yes. I never opened the door." The creature had smiled, and in the darkness the expression was worse than any violence. "You didn't need to," it had whispered. "Fear is an invitation. Doubt is a welcome. Every time you looked over your shoulder in the forest, every time you checked the shadows in the facility, every time you wondered if I was still watching, you opened the door a little wider. And now, Sergeant Cross, the door is wide enough for me to step through." Cross had screamed then, a sound of pure terror that she couldn't control, and she had emptied her weapon into the creature's chest, watching the flashes illuminate its pale form, watching the bullets pass through it as if it were made of smoke. It hadn't flinched, hadn't reacted, hadn't acknowledged the violence in any way. "Bullets cannot harm what is not flesh," it had said, and then it had moved. Not quickly, not with the speed it had shown in the forest. Slowly, deliberately, it had approached the bed, and Cross had been unable to move, unable to run, unable to do anything but watch as it reached out with its too many fingers and touched her face. The touch had been cold, colder than any winter night, and it had burned like frostbite. But worse than the physical sensation was the intrusion into her mind, the feeling of something else pushing into her thoughts, taking up space in her consciousness, making itself at home in the person she had been. "Sleep now," the creature had whispered. "And when you wake, you will be me and I will be you, and we will walk together in the dark places where the light has gone out." Cross had tried to scream, tried to fight, tried to hold on to herself with desperate strength. But the darkness had been stronger, and the cold had been deeper, and the last thing she had seen as her eyes closed was the creature's face merging with her own in the mirror of her mind, its void eyes becoming her eyes, its hunger becoming her hunger. The extraction team had found her the next morning, sitting upright in bed, her weapon empty on the floor beside her. She had been alive, conscious, apparently unharmed. But when they had asked her what happened, she had smiled with too many teeth in her eyes. Her eyes had been voids, perfect circles of nothing that swallowed the light and promised only darkness. "The others," the extraction leader had asked. "Gone," Cross had said, and her voice had held an echo that wasn't quite human. "They let the light go out. They invited me in. And now they are part of me and I am part of them, and we wait together in the dark." The extraction team had never reported back. The cabin had been found empty, the radio smashed, the vehicle still in the driveway. Cross had been found 3 days later, walking along a mountain road in the rain, her clothes soaked and her skin pale as moonlight. She had been taken to a hospital, then to a facility, then to a place that had no name. She never spoke again, not in words that others could understand. But those who sat with her in the dark hours before dawn sometimes reported hearing her whisper to herself, holding conversations with voices that weren't there, apologizing to people who had never existed. And sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, they saw her eyes change, saw the color drain from them until they became voids, empty circles that reflected nothing and promised everything. The creature was still out there, in the forests and the mountains and the dark places where humans didn't go. But it was also in here, in the minds of those who had survived, waiting for the moment when the light would go out and the invitation would be complete. And when that moment came, it would walk among them, wearing their faces, speaking with their voices, hunting with their hands. Because the Rake didn't need permission to enter. It only needed them to believe they were safe. Orang-Bati. Field recording Sarum Island expedition date. Redacted time, 23/47/18. The recording begins with the sound of rain on a canvas tent, the heavy tropical downpour that turns the world into a drumbeat of water. There is breathing, heavy and excited, and the soft rustle of fabric as someone moves. Dr. Thorne, whispering, breathless with excitement, this is incredible, I can't. I need to describe this, for the record, for posterity. The sound of something moving through vegetation, something large, pushing through ferns and underbrush. A wet, rhythmic sound, like leather being dragged across wet leaves. Dr. Thorne, the membrane, the wing membrane. It's slicing through the canopy. The structure is. God, the structure is perfect. I've never seen anything like it. It's not bat, it's not bird, it's something else entirely. A wet sound, like something heavy and organic being moved. A tearing noise, fabric or flesh, followed by a low, mournful sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. Dr. Thorne, voice dropping to a whisper. I can see it now. In the clearing, it's feeding the way it holds the prey, the precision of the. The recording cuts abruptly to a different sound. Wet, rhythmic chewing, not loud but close, very close. The microphone seems to be picking up every detail, the tearing of tissue, the grinding of bone, the wet suction of consumption. And beneath it, a sound that is worse than the eating, a long, mournful wail that sounds less like an animal and more like a human trying to scream through a throat full of blood. Dr. Thorne, screaming, "Oh God, itis." The recording ends with a sound like the microphone being dropped, followed by silence. End transcript. Addendum. Recording recovered from damaged equipment found at abandoned campsite. Dr. Thorne's body was never recovered. The wet sounds were later identified as consistent with predation by large mammalian carnivore. The mournful wail remains unexplained. Dr. Jacob Thorne had spent his professional life being laughed at, not the gentle laughter of colleagues who found his theories eccentric but endearing. The harsh, mocking laughter of an academic community that had decided his work was not merely wrong but fundamentally unserious, the kind of research that gave scientific inquiry a bad name. Cryptozoology, the study of hidden animals, creatures that existed in the spaces between documented species, in the shadows of the known world. Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, the Chupacabra, names that conjured images of conspiracy theorists and crackpots, of blurry photographs and obvious hoaxes, of desperate attention seekers who traded scientific credibility for media exposure. Thorne had begun his career as a legitimate evolutionary biologist, had earned his PhD from a respected institution, had published papers in peer-reviewed journals that established him as a rising star in primate evolutionary studies. His early work on the divergence of Old World and New World monkeys had been groundbreaking, had offered new insights into the mechanisms of adaptive radiation that had reshaped understanding of simian evolution. But then had come the fossils. A private collector had contacted him, had offered access to specimens that had been removed from Indonesia under questionable circumstances, had hinted at something that didn't fit into any known taxonomy. Thorne had been skeptical, had expected another fake, another Piltdown man, another elaborate hoax designed to trap the unwary. But the specimens had been real, fragmentary, damaged, incomplete but real, bones that suggested a primate with adaptations for flight, wing bones, hollow and structured like those of bats but articulated like those of primates, skull fragments that showed brain capacity consistent with higher intelligence, pelvic structures that indicated bipedal locomotion when grounded. The creature, if it existed, represented a missing link that shouldn't exist. A primate that had evolved flight independently of bats, that had developed intelligence comparable to great apes, that had established itself in the isolated ecosystems of the Malay archipelago and remained hidden from scientific discovery. Thorne had tried to publish, had submitted papers to journals that had rejected them without review, had presented at conferences where his colleagues had walked out, had sought funding from institutions that had laughed him out of their offices. Flying monkeys, they had called his research, the next Bigfoot. "You're destroying your career," his department chair had told him. "You're throwing away 15 years of legitimate work for fairy tales." "These specimens are real," Thorne had insisted. "The bones don't lie." "The bones are unprovenanced," the chair had countered. "They could be from anywhere. They could be manufactured. They could be the remains of known species that have been altered to appear anomalous. I have evidence. I have witnesses. I have historical records that document sightings going back centuries. You have stories, legends, mythology. You don't have science. The meeting had ended with Thorne's tenure being revoked, his funding being cut, his access to university resources being terminated. He had become a pariah in the academic community, a cautionary tale told to graduate students about the dangers of pursuing fringe theories. But Thorne hadn't stopped. He had continued his research, had funded his work through private donations and personal loans, had spent his savings and his retirement and his reputation on the pursuit of something that the scientific establishment insisted didn't exist. It was during this period of isolation that he had discovered the journals of Tyson Hughes. Hughes had been a missionary in Indonesia during the 1980s, a Methodist minister who had spent 7 years in the remote regions of the Malay archipelago, translating scripture and providing medical care to communities that had little contact with the outside world. His journals, archived in a church library in Ohio, had been forgotten for decades, dismissed as the ramblings of a religious fanatic who had succumbed to tropical fever. But Thorne had recognized something in Hughes's writing that others had missed: the detailed observations, the careful documentation, the scientific rigor that Hughes had applied to his descriptions of local fauna. The missionary had been an amateur naturalist, had recorded his observations with the precision of someone who understood the value of accurate description. And his descriptions of the Orang-Bati had been precise indeed. Creatures that fly like bats but move like men, Hughes had written. Intelligent eyes that watch from the canopy, mournful cries that sound like human voices. They hunt at night, taking the weak and the isolated, leaving no trace but the fear they inspire. Hughes had claimed to have seen them multiple times, had observed them from a distance, had even attempted to photograph them with a camera that had been damaged in a fall before he could develop the film. But his most interesting observation had been about their behavior, about the way they seemed to respond to specific stimuli. They are drawn to sound, Hughes had written. Not just any sound, but specific frequencies. The local people know this, have known it for generations. They use wooden instruments to keep the creatures away, instruments that produce tones the Orang-Bati find painful. And sometimes, when they need to hunt the creatures, they use different frequencies, tones that attract rather than repel. Thorne had underlined this passage, had read it a dozen times, had recognized in it the key that might unlock everything. The Orang-Bati weren't just biological anomalies. They were creatures with specific sensory adaptations, with biological vulnerabilities that could be exploited. They were intelligent enough to communicate, to coordinate, to avoid detection by a species that had become the dominant predator on the planet. But they could be found, could be studied, could be proven. The location Hughes had described was specific: Seram Island in the Maluku province of Indonesia, Mount Kairatu, an extinct volcano that rose from the island's interior, surrounded by rainforests that had never been fully explored by Western science. A region where the locals spoke of the men with wings in whispers, where children were taught to fear the dark not because of tigers or snakes, but because of something that descended from the sky. Thorne had known he needed to go there, had known that Seram Island represented his last chance to prove his theories, to validate his career, to show the world that he had been right all along. But he had needed funding, needed equipment, needed a team. The venture capitalist had come to him, rather than the other way around. Richard Vance had made his fortune in tech startups, had sold 3 companies for amounts that made Thorne's research budget look like pocket change. He was also an amateur naturalist, a collector of rare specimens, a man who had become bored with conventional wildlife and sought something that would make his name immortal. "I've read your papers," Vance had said, sitting in Thorne's cramped office with its piles of rejected manuscripts and its walls covered with maps of unexplored regions. The ones you couldn't get published. I have. Resources. I can fund an expedition. State-of-the-art equipment, the best team money can buy. Why? Thorne had asked, suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. What's in it for you? Discovery, Vance had said, his eyes gleaming with the hunger that Thorne recognized from his own mirror. The chance to be part of something that changes everything. My name associated with the discovery of a new species, a new genus, maybe even a new order. Think of it, Dr. Thorne, we would be immortal. And if we find nothing, if the creatures don't exist, then we find nothing, but I'm willing to bet they do exist. Your research is compelling. The specimens, if genuine, are extraordinary. And the location. Saram Island is one of the least explored regions on Earth. If flying primates exist anywhere, they exist there. Thorne had agreed, had accepted the funding, had begun assembling the team that would accompany him into the heart of the unknown. The guide had been the first recruit. Marco Santoso was a native of Sulawesi, a man who had spent his life guiding scientific expeditions through the Indonesian archipelago. He was cynical, experienced, unimpressed by theories or legends. He had seen too much to believe in monsters, had survived too many expeditions that promised discovery and delivered disappointment. Flying monkeys, he had said when Thorne had explained the mission. I've heard the stories. Every island has stories. Usually they're just misidentified flying foxes, big bats. People see what they want to see. These aren't flying foxes, Thorne had insisted. They're something else, something that walks like us, thinks like us, hunts like us. If you say so, Santoso had replied, though his expression had suggested he was humoring a madman for the paycheck. The field biologist had been young, eager, desperate to prove herself in a field dominated by established names. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to the technical Sergeant Chen of the previous story, but sharing the same desperation for discovery that drove people to the edges of the known world, had specialized in primate behavior, had spent 3 years studying orangutans in Borneo, had published papers that suggested intelligence in non-human primates that bordered on the remarkable. If these creatures are as intelligent as you suggest, she had said during their interview, if they coordinate their hunting and communicate complex information, then they would be the most significant primate discovery since ever. It would rewrite everything we know about evolution, about intelligence, about what it means to be human. That's what I'm hoping for, Thorne had said. And if we don't find them, if they don't exist, then we document what we do find. We study the ecosystem. We come back with data that advances our understanding, even if it doesn't validate my theories. She had agreed, had signed on, had brought to the expedition her expertise in primate tracking and her knowledge of Indonesian ecosystems. The security specialist had been Vance's addition, a man named Victor Kowalski who had spent 15 years in private military contracting before transitioning to civilian work. He was massive, scarred, unsmiling. He carried weapons that Thorne didn't recognize and spoke in monosyllables that suggested he viewed the entire expedition as an unnecessary risk. Mr. Vance wants you protected, Kowalski had said. I'll protect you, but I don't believe in monsters. If something kills us out there, it's going to be something normal. Tigers, snakes, disease, not flying monkeys. I don't need you to believe, Thorne had said. I just need you to be ready. I'm always ready. The team had assembled in Jakarta, had flown to Ambon, had taken a chartered boat to Saram Island. They had arrived in late afternoon, the sun setting over the mountains in a display of tropical color that would have been beautiful if not for what awaited them. The local guides had refused to approach Mount Karatu, had refused to even speak its name. They had unloaded the team's equipment at the edge of the village and had retreated to their boats, their eyes averted, their faces pale with fear. What's wrong with them? Chen had asked, watching the guides flee. They think the mountain is hungry, Santoso had translated. They say it eats people. They say the sky is full of teeth. Superstition, Kowalski had grunted. They always have stories to explain what they don't understand. But Thorne had noticed something. The guides weren't just afraid. They were terrified in a way that suggested experience rather than rumor. These weren't people who had heard stories. These were people who had seen something, who had lost something, who knew in their bones that the mountain was dangerous. "We proceed as planned," Thorne had said. "We set up base camp at the mountain's base. We establish observation posts. We document everything." They had hiked into the rainforest, leaving behind the village and the coast and the last traces of civilization. The jungle had closed around them like a mouth, the canopy blocking the sky, the humidity pressing against them like a physical weight. Thorne had felt it immediately, the sense of being watched, of being hunted, of being evaluated by intelligences that were not human. He had told himself it was paranoia, the result of too many years of being dismissed, too much investment in a theory that had to be true. But the feeling had persisted, had grown stronger with each step into the forest, until by the time they reached the base of Mount Karadu, Thorne had known with absolute certainty that they were not alone. Something was watching them from above, something intelligent, something hungry. And it was waiting for them to make the first mistake. The base camp had been established in a clearing that Santoso had selected for its defensibility. The jungle was so dense that visibility was limited to 20 meters in any direction, but the clearing offered space for the tents, the equipment, the generators that would power their technology. Chen had set up the acoustic monitoring equipment, had calibrated the sensors that would detect sounds outside the range of human hearing. Kowalski had established a perimeter, had set up motion sensors and trip wires that would alert them to any approach. Santoso had organized the supplies, had coordinated with the porters who would ferry equipment from the coast. And Thorne had sat by the fire, staring up at the canopy, watching for movement in the leaves. He had seen it on the second day. A silhouette against the sky, visible through a rare gap in the canopy, something that moved with the grace of a gliding bird but with the bulk of a large mammal. It had been there for only a moment, had passed across the gap and vanished into the dense foliage, but Thorne had seen enough. "Did you see that?" he had asked, pointing upward. "See what?" Chen had replied, looking up from her equipment. "In the canopy, something just flew past, something large." "Probably a hornbill," Santoso had said. "They get big out here, wingspans up to 2 meters. "That wasn't a hornbill, it moved wrong, it was gliding without flapping." "Soaring birds can glide for long periods," Chen had said. "It's aerodynamically efficient." "It wasn't a bird," Thorne had insisted. "It was a primate. I saw limbs, I saw a torso, it had arms." The others had exchanged glances, the kind of glances that Thorne had seen too often in his career. The look of people humoring a madman, of indulging a delusion, of pretending to believe in something they knew was impossible. "We'll set up cameras," Chen had said diplomatically, "motion-activated with infrared capability. If something's moving through the canopy, we'll capture it." But the cameras had shown nothing in the first 3 days. The motion sensors had triggered only for small mammals, birds, insects. The acoustic monitors had recorded the sounds of the jungle, the calls of birds, the screams of monkeys, the rustle of leaves, but nothing that suggested the presence of anomalous creatures. Thorne had begun to doubt himself, had begun to wonder if he had seen what he wanted to see, if the stress of the expedition had caused him to hallucinate, if his obsession had finally crossed the line into madness. And then had come the first breach. It had happened on the 4th night. The team had been in their tents, the fire had burned down to embers, and the jungle had been silent in the way that jungles are never silent, the heavy, expectant quiet that suggests predators are near. Kowalski had been on watch, sitting by the remains of the fire with his weapon across his knees, scanning the tree line with night vision goggles. He had been the first to hear it, a sound like wind but not wind, like breathing but not breathing, like something large moving through the canopy with deliberate silence. "Contact," he had whispered into his radio. "Something in the trees, northwest bearing." Thorne had emerged from his tent, had grabbed his camera, had moved to Kowalski's position. "Where?" "Up there." Kowalski had pointed, and Thorne had followed his finger to a section of canopy that seemed darker than the surrounding forest. And he had seen it. A shape, visible only as an absence of stars. A silhouette that blocked the night sky in a configuration that suggested folded wings, hunched posture, watching eyes. "It's one of them," Thorne had whispered. "It's an Orang-Bati." "I don't see anything," Kowalski had said, though his voice had suggested doubt. "Look at the way it moves, the way it holds itself. That's not a bat, that's not a bird, that's a primate." The shape had moved then, had unfolded itself from its perch, had spread wings that were visible even in the darkness as a greater absence against the stars. It had dropped from its branch, had caught the air, had glided in a wide circle above the camp. "Jesus," Kowalski had breathed, and for the first time his voice had held something other than skepticism. "What the hell is that?" "It's real," Thorne had said, his voice breaking with emotion. "It's actually real." The creature had circled 3 times, had studied them from above with an intelligence that Thorne could feel even at this distance. It had been assessing them, he had realized, evaluating them as potential threats, as potential prey. It had known they were there, had probably known since their arrival, and it had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And then it had made a sound, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once, that vibrated in Thorne's chest and made his teeth ache. It had been a call, he had realized later, a communication, a signal to others that humans had entered their territory. The sound had been answered. From multiple directions, from the canopy all around them, other voices had joined the first, creating a chorus of mourning that suggested the creatures were not just acknowledging their presence but grieving it. "They're surrounding us," Chen had said, her voice tight with fear. "They're all around the camp." "How many?" Kowalski had asked. "Dozens, maybe more. I can hear them moving in the trees." "We need to get inside," Santoso had said. "We need to get into the tents, stay low, wait for dawn." "We're not running from them," Thorne had said. "This is what we came for, this is the proof." "This is a threat," Kowalski had countered. "Those things are predators, they're sizing us up. If we don't show strength, they'll attack." "Then show strength," Thorne had said. "Fire your weapon, let them know we're not prey." Kowalski had hesitated, had looked at the shapes moving in the canopy, had considered the consequences of his actions. Then he had raised his rifle, had fired 3 shots into the air. The sound had been deafening in the jungle night, the echoes bouncing off trees and rocks and the mountain itself. The creatures had gone silent, had frozen in their positions, had seemed to consider this new information. And then they had laughed. It hadn't been human laughter, but it had been close enough to be recognizable. A sound like hooting, like chittering, like the expression of amusement by creatures that found human displays of force quaint, adorable, ultimately irrelevant. "They think it's funny," Chen had whispered. "They think we're funny," Thorne had corrected. "They think they're not afraid of us." The creatures had withdrawn after that, had melted back into the canopy, had left the camp in silence that was somehow worse than their presence. But they had continued to watch, Thorne had known, had continued to evaluate, had continued to plan. The next morning, they had found the first evidence of the creature's biology. Santoso had discovered it while checking the perimeter. A shed skin, translucent and leathery, draped over a branch like a discarded cloak. Thorne had examined it with reverent hands, had photographed it, had collected samples for analysis. The material was unlike anything he had seen. Not quite skin, not quite membrane, but something in between. The surface was covered in microscopic structures that suggested sensory organs, that indicated the creatures could detect air pressure, temperature, chemical signatures through their integument. "This is incredible," he had breathed. "It's a sensory organ. The entire surface is a sensory organ. They can feel the air moving, can detect prey by the heat they radiate, can sense chemical traces from hundreds of meters away." That would make them incredibly efficient hunters, Chen had observed. That would make them apex predators, Thorne had corrected. In this ecosystem, they're the top of the food chain. Everything else is prey, including us if they decide we are. The discovery had energized the team, had transformed their skepticism into cautious excitement. They were on the verge of something unprecedented, something that would change everything. The shed skin was proof, undeniable evidence that the creatures existed and were more complex than anyone had imagined. But it was also a warning. The creatures were aware of them, were studying them in return, were leaving deliberate traces of their presence. This wasn't accidental discovery. This was controlled revelation, the creatures choosing when and how to reveal themselves. They were being hunted, Thorne had realized. Not as prey, not yet, but as subjects of interest. The Orang-Bati were scientists too, in their way, studying the new intruders in their territory, learning their behaviors, their vulnerabilities, their potential as threats or resources. And Thorne had welcomed it, had embraced the danger, the risk, the possibility of death. Because this was what he had been searching for, what he had sacrificed everything to find. The discovery of a lifetime, the validation of his theories, the proof that would make him immortal. He had just forgotten that immortality came in different forms, and some of them were worse than death. The climb toward Mount Kairatu had begun on the 5th day, the team leaving behind the relative safety of the base camp to venture into terrain that grew steeper, denser, and more obviously hostile with each meter of elevation. The map that Thorne had constructed from Hughes's journals had indicated a network of caves near the volcano's summit, locations where the missionary had claimed to have seen the Orang-Bati congregating in numbers that suggested nesting behavior. "If they're primates," Thorne had explained during the morning briefing, "they'll have established territories, breeding grounds, social hierarchies. The caves would provide shelter, protection for young, a defensible position against predators." "We're the predators here," Kowalski had reminded him. "Don't forget that." "Not to them," Thorne had said. "To them, we're intruders, trespassers, potential threats that need to be evaluated and, if necessary, eliminated." The trail had been barely visible, a path that seemed more imagined than real, winding through vegetation so dense that they had needed to cut their way forward with machetes. The humidity had increased with the elevation, the air becoming thick and heavy, pressing against their lungs like a physical weight. Chen had documented everything, the changing flora as they climbed, the decreasing biodiversity as the altitude increased, the signs of animal activity that grew more sparse and more specific the higher they went. There were no large mammals here, no tigers or deer or the wild pigs that populated the lower elevations. The only signs of life were avian, aerial, the marks of creatures that moved through the canopy rather than the ground. "This is their territory," she had observed. "Everything else has been driven out." "Or eaten," Santoso had added grimly. The first evidence of predation had been found at midday. Kowalski had stopped abruptly, had raised his hand in warning, had pointed toward a tree where something had been hung from a low branch. It had been a monkey, or what remained of one. The body had been eviscerated, the organs removed with surgical precision, the carcass arranged in a position that suggested display rather than consumption. The eyes had been removed, the sockets empty holes that seemed to stare at them with accusation. "This is a message," Thorne had said, his voice hushed. "It's a kill," Kowalski had corrected. "Predators do this. They cache food, they display dominance." "It's both. Look at the arrangement, the precision. This isn't random, it's deliberate. They're showing us what they can do. Or they're showing us what will happen to us, Chen had said. Thorne had photographed the display, had documented it with the clinical detachment of a scientist, but his hands had shaken as he worked. The message was clear. The Orang-Bati knew they were coming. The Orang-Bati were ready, and the Orang-Bati were not afraid. They had continued upward, the trail becoming steeper, the vegetation giving way to rocky outcroppings as they approached the volcano's flank. The caves had become visible then, dark mouths in the mountain's face, exuding air that was warm and sulphurous and smelled of ancient fire. The vents are still active, Chen had said, testing the air with a portable sensor. The volcano isn't extinct, it's dormant. There's geothermal activity, gas emissions, the potential for eruption. We'll stay away from the active vents, Thorne had said. Focus on the caves that are stable. But the caves had all shown signs of habitation. The entrances had been marked with scratchings that might have been territorial displays. The floors had been covered with detritus that included bones and shed skins and other remains that Thorne had collected with shaking hands. The bones had been the most disturbing. They were not just animal. Mixed among the remains of monkeys and birds and the occasional small mammal were fragments that Thorne had recognized with growing horror. Human bones, finger bones, teeth, fragments of skull that bore marks suggesting they had been opened to extract the contents. Hughes, he had whispered, the locals, anyone who came here before us. They're eating people, Kowalski had said, his face pale. They're hunting humans. They're not just hunting, Chen had said, examining the bones with professional detachment that barely masked her revulsion. They're selecting. These aren't random kills. They're choosing specific individuals. See the patterns in the damage, the way certain bones are preserved while others are destroyed. They're keeping trophies, collecting specific parts. What parts? The brain cases, the skill bones, the fingers. Why? Intelligence, Thorne had said, his voice hollow. They're collecting intelligence, literally. The brain tissue contains information, memories, neural patterns. They're consuming them, learning from them. That's insane, Kowalski had said. It's brilliant. If they're as intelligent as we think, if they have culture and society, then consuming the brain tissue of their prey would give them access to their prey's knowledge, their skills, their memories. They would literally become smarter by eating smart things. And humans are the smartest things on the island, Chen had finished. Santoso had corrected. The humans who came before us were the smartest things. Now we are. The realization had settled over them like a cold blanket. They weren't just researchers anymore. They weren't just explorers. They were potential resources, potential prey, potential sources of the intelligence that the Orang-Bati seemed to crave. And they had walked willingly into the heart of their territory. The abandoned outpost had been discovered on the 6th day, a structure that hadn't appeared on any map Thorne had studied, that suggested someone had been here before Hughes, someone who had established a permanent presence and then vanished. It had been a research station, built from local materials but with techniques that suggested Western construction. The walls had been reinforced concrete, the roof had been corrugated metal, the interior had contained equipment that dated from the 1970s, but that had been advanced for its time. And it had been occupied by Tyson Hughes. The missionary's name had been carved into a wooden beam over the entrance, along with dates that suggested he had spent nearly 2 years in this location. This is where he wrote the journals, Thorne had said, his voice hushed with reverence. This is where he made his observations. The interior had been stripped of most portable equipment, but the structure itself remained intact, protected from the jungle by its concrete walls and metal roof. In the back room, they had found what Thorne had been searching for, Hughes's private diary, hidden in a hollow space behind a loose panel. The diary had been water damaged, the pages stuck together, the ink faded and blurred. But Thorne had been able to read enough, had pieced together the story that Hughes had kept from his official records, the truth that he had hidden even from the church that had sent him. He didn't just observe the Orang-Bati, Thorne had said, his voice trembling as he read. He studied them. He tried to communicate with them. He made a terrible mistake. The entry had been dated 3 months before Hughes had left Sarum Island, before he had returned to the United States, before he had died in an Ohio hospital of causes that had never been fully explained. "I have led them to the village," Hughes had written. "I thought I was helping. I thought I could establish peace, trust, mutual understanding, but I was wrong. They don't want peace. They want prey, and I have shown them where to find it." The entry had described an event that Hughes had called the Night of Descent. The Orang-Bati, responding to some signal that Hughes had inadvertently provided, had descended upon a nearby village in coordinated waves, taking the children first, then the elderly, then anyone who couldn't flee fast enough. Dozens had died. Dozens more had been taken, carried up into the caves where their screams had echoed for hours before falling silent. "They harvested them," Hughes had written, "not just for food but for knowledge. They wanted to understand us, to learn our ways, to become better hunters, and I gave them the opportunity. I led them to the village. I showed them the way." The guilt had consumed him, Thorne had realized. The knowledge that his good intentions had resulted in massacre. The understanding that the creatures he had tried to befriend were not misunderstood innocents, but calculating predators who had played him as skillfully as he had tried to play them. He didn't forge trust with the locals, Thorne had said, closing the diary. He earned their hatred. He was responsible for the deaths of their families, and he kept it secret because he couldn't bear the shame. But the creatures learned from it, Chen had said. They learned that humans could be manipulated, that we could be led, that our compassion, our desire to understand, could be turned against us. "And they remember," Santoso had added. "They're still here, still watching, still waiting for someone to make the same mistake Hughes made." Thorne had looked at the diary in his hands, at the faded ink and the water-damaged pages, and he had felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. He was making the same mistake. He was following Hughes's path, seeking the same discovery, walking into the same trap. But he couldn't stop. The knowledge was too seductive. The discovery was too close. He was here in the heart of their territory, surrounded by evidence of their existence, and he couldn't turn back now. "We need to be careful," he had said, though his voice had lacked conviction. "We need to remember that they're intelligent, that they're watching, that they're waiting for us to make a mistake." "And when we do," Kowalski had asked. "We try not to make one." But they had already made it. They had come here to this place at this time. They had entered the territory of creatures who viewed them as resources, as prey, as opportunities to expand their knowledge. The mistake had been made 3 days ago, when they had first set foot on Sarum Island. The only question now was how long they had before the creatures decided to collect. The frequency emitter had been Thorne's idea, inspired by Hughes's observations about the creature's sensitivity to sound. If the Orang-Bati could be attracted by specific frequencies, then those same frequencies could be used to lure them into observation range, to capture them, to prove their existence beyond doubt. "It's a risk," Chen had said. "If they respond to the frequency, they might respond aggressively." "We'll be ready," Kowalski had promised. "We'll have the trank guns, the nets, the restraints. If they come, we'll be able to capture at least one." "And if there are more than one?" Santoso had asked. "Then we'll capture as many as we can." The emitter had been set up at the mouth of the largest cave, positioned to project its signal into the depths where the creatures were believed to nest. Thorne had calibrated the frequency based on Hughes's notes, had adjusted the amplitude to maximize attraction while minimizing threat. "It should take about 30 minutes, he had said. "If they're in the area, they'll hear it, they'll investigate." They had waited, tense and silent, as the emitter broadcast its signal into the darkness. The sound had been ultrasonic, outside the range of human hearing, but Thorn had felt it as a pressure in his skull, a vibration in his teeth, a sense of something being called from great distances. 20 minutes had passed, then 25, then 30. Nothing, Kowalski had said. Maybe it doesn't work. Or maybe they're smarter than we thought, Chen had said. Maybe they recognize a trap. Or maybe, Thorn had begun, but the words had died in his throat. The sound had come first. A rush of air, like the flap of wings, but multiplied, amplified, layered into a chorus that suggested not one creature but dozens. The canopy had moved, had shaken with the passage of something large, something coordinated, something that approached with the silence of calculated menace. "They're coming," Santoso had whispered. "From where?" Kowalski had demanded, his weapon raised. "Everywhere." The first creature had dropped from the canopy above them, had landed with a wet thud on the cave floor not 10 meters from where they stood. It had been larger than Thorn had expected, nearly 2 meters tall when it unfolded from its crouch, with wings that spread to nearly 4 meters from tip to tip. The body had been primate, unmistakably so. The torso had been muscular, covered in short gray fur. The limbs had been long, jointed for climbing and gliding, ending in hands that had too many fingers, each tipped with curved claws. The face had been almost human, with forward-facing eyes that gleamed with intelligence and hunger, a nose that was flatter than a human's but more defined than an ape's, and a mouth that opened to reveal teeth that were designed for tearing meat. But the wings had been the most remarkable feature. They had been membranes like those of a bat, but structured differently, supported by elongated fingers rather than the modified arm bones of chiropterans. The membrane itself had been translucent, veined with red vessels that pulsed with circulation, and it had glistened with moisture that might have been dew or might have been something else. "My God," Thorn had whispered, "it's perfect." "It's a trap," Kowalski had said, and he had been right. More creatures had descended, had dropped from the canopy in coordinated waves, had surrounded the humans in a ring that allowed no escape. They had been silent, had made no sound, had simply watched with eyes that reflected the light from the humans' headlamps with a gleam that suggested amusement. "How many?" Chen had asked, her voice barely audible. "Too many," Santoso had answered. The creatures had numbered in the dozens, perhaps the hundreds. They had filled the trees around the cave, had perched on branches and rocks and any surface that could support their weight, had created a living wall of wings and claws and watching eyes. And they had been communicating. Thorn had been sure of it, even though he couldn't hear anything. The creatures had been looking at each other, exchanging glances that suggested coordination, planning, strategy. They had been deciding what to do with the intruders in their territory. "We need to leave," Kowalski had said. "Slowly, don't run, don't provoke them." "We can't leave," Thorn had said. "This is the proof. This is everything we've been searching for. We need to capture one, document them." "They're going to kill us," Kowalski had said. "They're going to kill us and eat us, and there's nothing we can do to stop them." "Then we make it worth their while." Thorn had raised his camera, had begun to film, had documented the creatures with desperate speed. "We show the world what they are. Even if we die, the evidence survives." The creatures had seemed to find this amusing. Several of them had made sounds that might have been laughter, low hooting that vibrated in the humans' chests and made their skin crawl. "They're laughing at us," Chen had said. "Then let them laugh." Thorn had continued to film, his hands shaking but his focus absolute. "Let them know, that we see them, that we understand what they are." One of the creatures had detached itself from the group, had approached Thorn with a deliberation that suggested curiosity rather than aggression. It had stopped 3 meters away, had cocked its head in a gesture that was almost human, and had spoken. Not in words, but in sounds that assembled themselves into meaning in Thorn's mind. "You called us," the creature had seemed to say. You invited us. We have come. I want to understand you, Thorn had said, his voice trembling. I want to learn from you. I want to know what you are. We are what you will become, the creature had seemed to reply. We are the future you are evolving toward, the intelligence you seek, the knowledge you crave. We have consumed thousands of your kind. We have learned everything you know. We are you, and soon you will be us. No, Thorn had said. We're not prey, we're not resources, we're researchers, scientists, we want to coexist. Coexistence is consumption, the creature had said. Learning is eating. Understanding is digestion. You have sought us to know us. We will know you completely. It had moved then, faster than Thorn could track, and its claws had closed around his arm, not to injure but to hold, to examine, to evaluate. The touch had been cold, the skin rough and textured, and the strength in those fingers had been unmistakable. You will teach us, the creature had said, and then you will feed us. The attack had come without warning. One moment the creatures had been watching, and the next they had been moving, coordinated strikes from multiple directions that targeted the humans with surgical precision. Kowalski had been the first to fall. A creature had dropped from above, had wrapped its wings around him, had lifted him into the air with strength that defied its apparent weight. He had screamed, had fired his weapon into the creature's body, but the bullets had passed through the wing membrane without effect, and the creature had carried him upward, higher and higher, toward the volcanic vents that exuded heat and gas and the promise of death. "Help me," Kowalski had screamed, his voice fading as he rose. "Thorn, help me." But Thorn had been frozen, unable to move, unable to respond. He had watched his security specialist disappear into the canopy, had heard his screams fade, had known with terrible certainty that he would never see him again. "Run!" Chen had screamed, and she had grabbed Thorn's arm, had pulled him away from the cave, had forced him to move when his body wanted only to freeze. They had run, had plunged into the jungle with the creatures in pursuit, had fled through vegetation that tore at their skin and tripped their feet. The Orang-Bati had followed, had moved through the canopy above them, had tracked them with patient efficiency that suggested they were being herded rather than hunted. "They're driving us," Thorn had gasped as they ran. "They're pushing us toward something." "The cliffs," Santoso had said. "They're driving us toward the cliffs." He had been right. The terrain had been changing, had been becoming steeper, rockier, more dangerous. The vegetation had thinned, had given way to exposed rock that offered no cover, no shelter, no hope of concealment. And ahead, visible through the trees, had been the cliffs, the edge of the caldera, a drop of hundreds of meters into the volcanic heart of the mountain. "We can't go back," Chen had said. "They're behind us, we can't go forward, the cliff is ahead of us." "Then we go sideways," Thorn had said. "We find another path." But there had been no other path. The Orang-Bati had been everywhere, had filled the trees and the rocks and the sky, had created a prison of wings and claws that allowed no escape. Santoso had been the next to die. He had tripped on a root, had fallen to his knees, and before he could rise, a creature had descended, had landed on his back, had wrapped its wings around him in an embrace that was almost tender. "Marco!" Thorn had screamed. Santoso had looked up, had met Thorn's eyes, and in that gaze had been the knowledge of his own death. The creature had extended its head, had opened its mouth, and had bitten into the back of Santoso's neck with surgical precision that severed the spinal cord instantly. Santoso had collapsed, his body going limp, and the creature had begun to feed, its teeth tearing flesh with practiced efficiency while its wings spread to cover the body like a shroud. "We need to go," Chen had said, pulling at Thorn's arm, "now while it's distracted." They had run, had left Santoso to his fate, had plunged deeper into the jungle with the sounds of feeding following them like a nightmare. The creatures had let them go, had allowed them to escape, had watched them flee with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. The mournful wail had started then, rising from somewhere ahead of them, somewhere in the direction they were running. It had been a sound like a human voice, like a person in terrible pain, and it had drawn them forward, had promised help, had promised rescue, had promised safety. "It's a trap," Thorn had said, even as he moved toward the sound. "It's mimicking distress, it's luring us." "I know," Chen had said, "but what choice do we have?" They had emerged into a clearing, had found themselves in a space surrounded by trees on all sides, with no exit except the way they had come. And in the center of the clearing, hanging from a branch at eye level, had been Kowalski. Not all of him, just the parts the creatures had found useful. His head, still attached to his spine, dangling by a thread of tissue. His hands arranged in a pattern that suggested meaning. His eyes removed and placed in his open mouth, staring at them with accusation. "Oh God," Chen had whispered. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." The wail had come again from above them, from the canopy that was suddenly full of movement, full of wings, full of the creatures that had been waiting for them to arrive. They wanted us here, Thorn had realized. This is their feeding ground. This is where they bring their prey. "Then we need to leave," Chen had said. "Now." But the creatures had descended, had filled the clearing, had surrounded them in a ring that was closer now, tighter now, more obviously hungry. "Please," Thorn had said, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender that was also a gesture of pleading. "We don't want to hurt you. We just want to understand, please." The creatures had responded with laughter, with hooting, with sounds that suggested amusement at the humans' presumption. "You do not understand," their collective voice had seemed to say. "You cannot understand. You are food. You are learning. You will become us and then you will understand." "No," Thorn had said. "We're not food, we're not prey, we're human." "You were human," the creatures had replied. "Now you are becoming." The attack had been swift, merciful compared to what they had done to Kowalski and Santoso. The creatures had moved in, had wrapped their wings around the humans, had lifted them from the ground with gentle strength. Thorn had felt himself rising, had felt the wind in his face, had seen the jungle falling away below him. The creature that held him had been warm, its body heat seeping into his skin, its wings blocking his view of everything except the sky that was brightening toward dawn. "You called us," the creature had whispered in his mind. "You invited us, now we invite you." "To what?" Thorn had asked, though he hadn't wanted to know. "To everything, to knowledge, to becoming, to the feast that never ends." They had flown higher, had risen toward the vents that exuded the heat and gas of the volcano, and Thorn had realized with terrible clarity what was about to happen. The creatures weren't going to eat him immediately. They were going to take him to their nest, to their young, to their community. They were going to share him, distribute him, make him part of their collective in a way that was worse than simple death. "Chen," he had screamed, searching for his colleague in the sky around him. "Chen, where are you?" Here her voice had come, faint and fading. "I'm here, they're taking me. Thorn, they're taking me." "Don't let them," he had shouted. "Fight, resist." "I can't," she had said. "I can't, they're too strong there. They're in my mind, they're showing me things I can't, things I don't want to see." "What things?" "The truth, what they are, what they want, what they're going to do to us." "Don't look, don't listen, close your mind." "I can't," she had whispered, and then her voice had been gone, consumed by the wind and the distance and the darkness that was rising around them. Thorn had been taken to a cave, a deep chamber in the volcano's flank where the air was warm and thick and smelled of sulfur and blood. The creatures had deposited him gently on the cave floor, had arranged his limbs in a position that suggested care rather than violence. And then they had waited. "What are you waiting for?" Thorn had asked, his voice shaking. "For you to understand," the creature that had carried him had said. "For you to accept, for you to invite us in." "I won't," Thorn had said. "I'll never invite you, I'll never accept." "You already have," the creature had said. When you called us with your machine, when you sought us out, when you entered our territory with desire in your heart, you invited us. The invitation was given. Now we accept." No, Thorn had whispered, but he had known it was true. He had invited them. He had sought them out, had pursued them, had demanded their attention. He had come into their territory with the arrogance of a species that believed itself supreme, and he had offered himself as tribute without even knowing it. "We will teach you," the creature had said. "We will show you what we are, and then you will join us, not as food but as family, as knowledge, as part of the whole. And if I refuse, then you will be food, but you will not refuse. You are a scientist, a seeker of truth. We offer truth. We offer knowledge. We offer the secrets of existence that your species has sought since the first mind emerged from the darkness. We offer everything, and in return we ask only that you become part of us." Thorn had looked at the creatures around him, at the intelligence in their eyes, at the hunger in their faces, at the wings that spread like promises of flight and freedom. He had been a seeker of truth, a pursuer of knowledge, a man who had sacrificed everything to understand the universe's secrets. And here were the secrets, here was the truth, here was knowledge beyond anything human science had achieved. "Show me," he had whispered, "show me what you know." The creature had smiled, had opened its mind to him, had poured into his consciousness everything that the Orang-Bati had learned over millions of years of existence. And Thorn had screamed, not from pain, but from the terrible weight of understanding. The universe was not what he had thought. Life was not what he had believed. Consciousness was not the miracle he had imagined, but a byproduct of hunger, of need, of the endless consumption that drove all things. The Orang-Bati were not the anomaly. They were the norm. All life consumed other life. All intelligence was built on the digestion of the less intelligent. The only difference was scale. The only morality was efficiency. "You see," the creature had said, as Thorn's mind expanded to encompass the horror. "You understand. You are ready." "No," Thorn had moaned. "No, this can't be. This isn't." "It is," the creature had said. "It always has been. And now you are part of it. You are us, and we are you. Welcome to the feast." The feeding had begun then, but not in the way Thorn had feared. The creatures hadn't torn him apart, hadn't consumed his flesh, hadn't reduced him to meat and bone. They had consumed his mind, had absorbed his consciousness into their network, had distributed his thoughts and memories and knowledge across their collective, making him part of something that was larger and more terrible than anything he had imagined. He had become an Orang-Bati, not in body but in mind. His consciousness had been uploaded, distributed, integrated. He had felt himself spreading, becoming multiple, existing in dozens of bodies across the island. He had flown, had hunted, had consumed. And he had known, with the terrible clarity of the collective, exactly what he was, what they were, what the universe demanded. Dr. Jacob Thorn had found his proof, had validated his theories, had become the discovery he had sought. And it was worse than he could have imagined. The process of transformation had not been immediate. The Orang-Bati had taken their time with Thorn, had savored the integration of his consciousness into their network, had explored his memories with the curiosity of scholars examining a rare text. They had learned from him, had absorbed his knowledge of human science and culture, had incorporated his understanding into their own vast reservoir of information. And they had taught him, in turn, had shown him the truth of their existence, the nature of their biology, the purpose of their being. They were old, far older than the human species. They had evolved in the forests of what would become Indonesia when the continents were different, when the climate was different, when the world was young and full of possibilities. They had developed flight not through the modification of forelimbs, as bats had done, but through the expansion of skin membranes between elongated fingers, a different evolutionary path that had resulted in a different kind of wing. They were primates, or had been once. Their ancestors had been small, arboreal creatures that had lived in the canopy, that had developed gliding as a means of moving between trees. Over millions of years, natural selection had favored those who could glide farther, faster, with more control. The membranes had expanded, the fingers had lengthened, the body had grown larger and more powerful. And their minds had grown as well. Intelligence had been favored in an environment where coordination, communication, and strategic thinking meant the difference between survival and death. They had developed language, culture, technology of a sort, tools made from wood and fiber, shelters constructed in the canopy, social structures that were complex and hierarchical. But the true transformation had come later, when they had discovered the secret of consciousness. Not just individual awareness, but networked cognition. The ability to share thoughts, memories, experiences across multiple minds. The evolution of a collective intelligence that was greater than the sum of its parts. This had required a biological innovation, the ability to consume and integrate the neural tissue of other species. The Orang-Bati had discovered that by eating the brains of their prey, they could absorb fragments of their prey's consciousness, could incorporate their memories and knowledge into their own. It had started as a byproduct of predation, a side effect of consuming the most nutrient-rich tissue. But over generations, it had become something more. They had learned to cultivate this ability, to maximize its effects, to use it as a means of expanding their collective intelligence. They had become farmers of consciousness, cultivating prey species, managing their populations, harvesting them at optimal times to maximize the knowledge gained. Humans had been their greatest discovery. The intelligence of Homo sapiens was unlike anything they had encountered. Complex, creative, capable of generating unique patterns of thought that added significantly to the collective. The Orang-Bati had been consuming humans for tens of thousands of years, had incorporated countless human minds into their network, had become more intelligent, more sophisticated, more capable with each integration. And they had learned to communicate, to establish relationships with human communities, to create arrangements that benefited both species. In some regions, they were worshipped as gods, fed sacrifices of livestock and criminals in exchange for protection and knowledge. In others, they were feared as demons, avoided and propitiated but never directly confronted. But always they were growing, always they were consuming, always they were becoming more than they had been. Thorn had understood this, had felt his own identity dissolving into the collective, had experienced the loss of individuality that was the price of joining the network. He was no longer just Jacob Thorn. He was Thorn and Chen and Kowalski and Santos and thousands of others. He was a node in a vast web of consciousness that spanned the island, that was reaching out to other islands, that would eventually encompass the entire archipelago. He could feel the others, could sense their presence in the back of his mind. Chen was there, her scientific curiosity intact, her fear replaced by something like wonder. Kowalski was there, his military discipline translated into coordination, his strength added to the collective's power. Santoso was there, his knowledge of the island and its people integrated into the network's understanding. And there were others, hundreds of others, humans who had been consumed over the decades, the centuries, the millennia. Missionaries and explorers and scientists and locals, all merged into the collective, all contributing their knowledge and experience to the whole. Hughes was there, the missionary who had first documented the Orang-Bati, who had tried to study them, who had ultimately been consumed by them. His guilt, his shame, his knowledge of what he had done, all of it was part of the network now, available to any who wished to access it. Thorn had felt Hughes's presence, had experienced his memories, had understood his tragedy. The missionary had thought he could establish communication, could build trust, could create a relationship of mutual benefit. But the Orang-Bati didn't negotiate. They consumed. And Hughes had been consumed, his good intentions converted into knowledge, his guilt preserved as a lesson to others who might try the same approach. You understand now, the collective voice had said, speaking with Thorn's own voice combined with thousands of others. You understand what we are, what you have become. I understand, Thorn had replied, and the words had been true, though they had been spoken with resignation rather than acceptance. You are not lost, the voice had continued. You are found, you are part of something greater than your individual existence. You will continue, you will grow, you will become. And my body. Your body is temporary. It will be consumed as all bodies are, but you will persist. You will exist in us. You will be us. The physical transformation had come later, after the mental integration was complete. The Orang-Bati had taken Thorn's body, had prepared it, had consumed it in a ritual that was both biological and cultural. They had eaten his flesh, had absorbed his nutrients, had made him part of their physical being as well as their mental. But they had kept some parts, trophies of a sort, reminders of what he had been, what he had contributed, what he had become. His skull, cleaned and preserved, added to the collection in the caves. His hands, arranged in patterns that meant something to the collective. His eyes, placed carefully in locations where they could watch, could observe, could continue his work of seeking and knowing. Thorn had felt all of this, had experienced his own consumption from the outside, had understood with terrible clarity the nature of his existence. He was not dead. He was not alive. He was something in between, something that had transcended both states, something that was simultaneously individual and collective, physical and mental, human and other. And he had been grateful. Despite the horror, despite the loss, despite the violation of everything he had been grateful, because he had found what he was seeking. He had discovered the truth. He had become part of the knowledge that he had spent his life pursuing. The other survivors had been found 3 days later. A search team, sent by Vance when the expedition had failed to check in, had discovered the remains of the camp, the evidence of the attack, the traces of what had happened. They had found Santoso's body, arranged carefully at the base of a tree. They had found Kowalski's remains, distributed across the clearing in patterns that suggested ritual rather than simple predation. They had found the equipment, the cameras, the frequency emitter that had started everything. And they had found the recording. Thorn's final audio, captured on a device that had been damaged but not destroyed, that had preserved his last words, his final moments, his terrible discovery. The recording had been analyzed, studied, discussed in hushed tones by people who didn't know what to make of it. The sounds of consumption, the mournful wail, Thorn's scream, all of it had been documented, classified, buried under layers of secrecy and denial. But the truth had leaked out, as truth always does. Stories had spread, legends had grown, rumors had circulated about the things that lived on Saram Island, the creatures that flew like bats but thought like men, the predators that consumed not just flesh but mind. And others had come. Scientists, hunters, adventurers, drawn by the same curiosity that had drawn Thorn, seeking the same discovery, walking into the same trap. The Orang-Bati had welcomed them, had consumed them, had added their knowledge to the collective. The network had grown. The island had become theirs completely, totally, in a way that no human presence could challenge. Expeditions had stopped coming, not because the danger was unknown, but because it was understood too well. The Orang-Bati were not a mystery to be solved. They were a truth to be avoided. But they were still there, still watching, still waiting. And they were still hungry. Chen had survived after a fashion. Unlike Thorn, she had not been fully integrated into the collective. She had resisted, had fought against the process, had clung to her individuality with desperate strength. The Orang-Bati had found this fascinating. They had never encountered resistance like hers, had never tried to integrate a consciousness that refused to dissolve. They had experimented with her, had tried different approaches, had sought to understand why she was different. She had been kept in a cave, separate from the collective but surrounded by it, aware of their presence but unable to join them. She had been fed, cared for, preserved in a state of isolation that was both mercy and torture. And she had planned, had observed, had learned. She had discovered that the Orang-Bati were not invincible. They had vulnerabilities, weaknesses, limitations that could be exploited. They were sensitive to certain frequencies, as Hughes had observed, sounds that caused them pain and disrupted their coordination. They were territorial, protective of their nesting sites, reluctant to venture far from their established territories. And they were dependent on the collective. An individual separated from the network was weakened, confused, vulnerable. She had also discovered that they feared fire. Not normal fire, but the specific combination of heat and light produced by volcanic vents. The sulfur, the gas, the intense temperature, all of it was toxic to them, damaging to their delicate wing membranes, disruptive to their sensory systems. She had planned her escape around this knowledge, had waited for the right moment, for the right conditions, for the opportunity that might never come. And then it had. An eruption, small, localized, but enough to create chaos in the caves, enough to drive the Orang-Bati from their nests, enough to provide cover for her flight. She had run, had fled through passages she had memorized during her captivity, had emerged into the jungle with the creatures in pursuit but disrupted, confused, weakened by the volcanic activity. She had reached the coast, had found a boat, had escaped the island with nothing but her life and her knowledge and the horror of what she had experienced. She had returned to civilization, had told her story to anyone who would listen, had tried to warn the world about what waited on Saram Island. They had called her mad, had institutionalized her, medicated her, dismissed her warnings as the delusions of trauma. She had spent years trying to convince them, trying to prove what she knew, trying to save others from the fate that had befallen her team. Eventually, she had stopped trying, had retreated into silence, had accepted her diagnosis, had lived out her life in a facility where no one believed her but everyone was kind. But she had never forgotten, had never stopped knowing what was true, had never stopped planning for the day when the Orang-Bati would expand beyond their island, when they would seek new territories, new prey, new knowledge. That day had not come in her lifetime, but she had known it would come. The creatures were patient, were eternal, were inevitable. Eventually they would grow beyond Saram Island. Eventually they would find the mainland. Eventually they would come for everyone. She had died old, alone, dismissed as a mad woman, but she had left records, hidden in places where they might be found by those who needed them. Warnings, instructions, the knowledge that might save lives when the Orang-Bati finally came. And they had come. 20 years after her death, the first sightings had been reported. Flying creatures in the night, taking livestock, taking pets, taking the unwary. The reports had been dismissed, explained away, buried under layers of denial. But they had continued, had grown, had spread. The Orang-Bati were expanding, were consuming, were becoming. And Chen's warnings, ignored in her lifetime, were finally being heard. Too late perhaps, too little certainly, but heard. The world was learning what Saram Island had known for millennia, that there were things in the dark that hungered for more than flesh, that there were predators that consumed consciousness itself, that there were creatures that were not animals, not monsters, but something else entirely. Something that waited. Something that watched. Something that would consume everything eventually, when the time was right. The Orang-Bati were coming. They had always been coming, and now, at last, the world was beginning to understand what that meant. The final recording, found in Chen's effects after her death, had been simple. A message to whoever might find it, whoever might listen, whoever might need to know. Don't seek them out. Don't try to understand them. Don't think you can communicate, negotiate, coexist. They are not what you think. They are not animals to be studied, not monsters to be defeated, not mysteries to be solved. They are the end, the consumption that waits for all things, the hunger that can never be satisfied, the knowledge that destroys the knower. I survived, but I shouldn't have. I escaped, but I didn't win. I lived, but I never forgot. They're still out there, still waiting, still hungry. And when they come for you, and they will come, remember my words. Don't fight, don't run, don't hope. Just accept. It's the only way to survive. Not as what you were, but as part of what they are. Part of the feast. Part of the knowledge. Part of the end. End of recording. Addendum. Dr. Sarah Chen died on redacted at the age of 67. Her warnings about the Orang-Bati were dismissed during her lifetime, but are now being reevaluated in light of recent events. The island of Saram remains quarantined. Expeditions are prohibited. The creatures, whatever they are, remain unclassified and unexplained. Final note: if you are reading this, if you have found this document, know that the Orang-Bati are real. They are intelligent, they are hungry, and they are waiting. The mountain is hungry, the sky is full of teeth. Don't look up. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.